So the last the documentary I just showed you dealt with the Franks and um, where we get the term France from, um, in French. And we covered in this textbook here in the introduction of Germanic kingdoms. I think it's fair to say that many Americans in the United States don't quite think of the totality of the legacy of Germanic kingdoms, Germanic tribes on Western Europe. We tend to only think of Germany because that's what we call the language German, and you think of Germans as Germany. Yes, Germans are unique and distinct from these other groups, and these various peoples evolved into different nation states that we all see and know of as being European. But this legacy is often kind of muted out here in understanding. And I've pointed out by discussing even with Beowulf that English is a Germanic tongue. Many do not English speakers don't even realize that it is strictly that it was influenced by Latin and to another degree French, which I'll explain in just a little bit later. But it is a language that really started off very close to the Scandinavian branches of Germanic tongue, the Norse languages. And in fact, Anglo-Saxon and the Jutes, who are often left out of this migration, came into the British Isles. And so, in a sense, there's several layers to Europe which kind of get grafted into each other. You had Celtic peoples, that were also tribal groups, and if you remember, the Romans talked about these groups, the Gauls, as they were called, and the Germans, but based on a Roman interpretation. These were not literate tribal groups, and so as they were conquered, the actual history and how they conceived of themselves is essentially lost for the most part. But essentially, the British Isles, you had Celtic peoples, and they're the real indigenous peoples in terms of, at least if we go back far enough, okay. And then you had Germanic tribes, and you had Slavs, and the Germanic peoples spread the most. So, just taking a look at the British Isles, the legendary King Arthur, who may or may not have existed, but he was, in legend, one of the last of the British Roman aristocrats to fight off the pagan Germans as they come into England. So as you noticed in the textbook, it talks about how, as Rome fell apart, the raiders from the coast of the sea, called Angles and Saxons, ended up pillaging and eventually taking over parts. That's the ancestors of the English, okay, the Anglo-Saxons, and in a sense they were like Vikings themselves in much of their culture and their language and their. If you look at Beowulf doesn't talk about it's one of the oldest English poems we have, but it doesn't talk about the British Isles. It talks about something in the past, and it talks about the Danes and Sweden. That's where essentially it's dealing with, and Norway. It's a poem reflecting on a Scandinavian past, a Germanic past, that then is going to take root in the British Isles. And it's also going to lead to still complications between Irish and Highland Scots, some of the and Welsh with the the English now in the British Isles. Okay. Um, and then we go to Frankish Gaul. I'm sure a lot of you are also thinking you don't think of Germanic when you think of France. And the French don't speak a Germanic language. They speak a Latin one. So France is kind of complicated. And I've been trying to decipher this over the last few months as well. Actually, for a few years, I was trying to think about this, and I've talked to some professors. Essentially, you had Gaul, which were Celtic peoples. They were conquered by the Romans, and then by Rome, and then you had the Roman, Gallo-Roman or Celtic-Roman blend that was taking place there. And so as you looked in the textbook how as Latin spread, that the Latin rulers already kind of blended their languages in with the indigenous population and created their own unique languages that are related but different. So French and Spanish and Portuguese, just for example, come out of the Latin order, but they evolved into their own separate things in a very unique way, in a way that you can't necessarily communicate with another person in that language, which is what happened to the English. That's why English is Germanic, but we might recognize German words that sound similar to English, but Germans don't inherently know what English speakers speak, and we don't know what they speak. Swedish people and Germans don't necessarily understand each other, even though it's a related language. So there's that evolution there. And then ultimately there were the Franks, the Germanic tribes, who took over and gave the name itself to the country of France. Okay, and instead of the German language dominating France, it would end up being the French that would be the main, the Latin-based language that would be the main one there. And this is what's wild or different about language. Sometimes people conquer an area and they make that language the dominant language of an area. In the sense, the British Isles, you see that English is the main language, even though it's not the only language of the British Isles. I mean, Irish do have news in places shown in Irish, is completely unrelated, and it's called Irish, by the way. Just for example, but English is the dominant language, and we have other times where people invade, and the main language on the ground that's already there ends up becoming that of the ruler. So we saw when the Swedish Vikings in the video from the last lecture invade the Rus and create Kiev and are a part of the eastern part of Europe. And immediately, as you saw in the documentary, the Scandinavian Germanic rulers married Slavs and eventually just became Slavic. And so the founders of the name for Russia and Kiev, which is the embryonic place of the birth of Russia, may have started with Germanic invaders, Swedish Vikings, but ends up being a Slavic kingdom nonetheless, with mainly a Slavic language dominating. And so then we see what happens with Spain, the same thing, and with Italy. And so, I want you to just kind of realize and visualize this, the enormity and the significance of these Germanic kingdoms on the Roman foundations. I'm going to stop here, and then I'm going to kind of go into a few more points on this and then move on to the next part.